So, J. Ruud, what lovable book are we talking about today?
Well, I'll give you a hint. Polish.
Sophie's Choice?
No, but not a bad guess.
Thank you. Welcome to Between the Covers, where J. Ruud, author of the Merlin Mysteries series and the Robin Hood Mystery series, and I, Stacey Margaret Jones, author of Mr. Catherine, discuss one book each week from J. Ruud's carefully cultivated list of the 100 most lovable novels in the English language. So I'm trying to guess this week's novel. I don't know them ahead of time. I need another hint, obviously.
Okay, here is hint number 2. Charles Marlowe.
Is it a Dashiell Hammett?
No! Not that Marlowe.
I'm embarrassing myself.
That's Philip Marlowe.
I know. Yeah, that's
But here's
right.
here's clue number 3.
Who knows what you pick? Anyway, go on.
Here is clue number 3.
Oh, wait. Have I read this book?
Yes, you have definitely read this book.
Okay.
Clue number 3. The horror. The horror.
Oh, Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness.
That is correct.
Wow. Okay. Interesting.
Heart of Darkness.
I knew you had respect for this novel. I didn't know you loved this novel.
It grows on you. I've taught it several times.
Yes. Have you recently reread it?
I have recently reread it. Actually, I recently listened to it.
Oh, okay. Because I haven't seen it around the
Audible.
house. Otherwise, I might have been tipped off.
I listened to it, and I listened to a special recording of it done by Kenneth Branagh.
Oh, well.
And as I said, I've taught this book several times in mainly intro to lit classes. And I've always been impressed by it, but I've always kind of gotten the feeling that it's very gloomy. I mean, with a title like Heart of Darkness, it's hard not to be gloomy.
Right.
But listening to Branagh's reading of it, I realized it really is comic in a lot of places.
All right. Well, we'll have to get into that. Let's not get ahead of ourselves here.
All right.
You have, as I said, this carefully cultivated list of 100 most lovable novels in the English language, and you started your own process by reading other publications' lists. So who else thinks that this is a novel of note?
This is on actually at least 69 different great books lists.
Please. Unlike Mrs. Dalloway, I would like you not to read every list.
I didn't read them all for Mrs. Dalloway. I read only maybe a third of them for Mrs. Dalloway.
Well,
and this is only probably maybe a third.
Give us the high points.
So Heart of Darkness is included in the Great American Read from PBS. It's on the College Board's list of 101 great books recommended for college-bound readers. It was 67th on the famous Modern Library 100 Best Novels, 46th on 100 Stories That Shaped the World from BBC, 38th on Waterstone's Books of the Century, 21st on BBC's list of the 100 Greatest British Novels, 21st on Radcliffe's list of 100 Best Novels, and it was number 9 on El País, Favorite Books of 100 Spanish Authors. And it's on many other lists.
So, favorite books of authors who are Spanish, their favorite books.
Right.
Because obviously Joseph Conrad is not Spanish.
No.
He's Polish.
It's Spanish writers who chose their favorite novels from world literature.
All right, there we go. All right, so it's bona fide.
Bona fide.
And we can put a bigger list of the lists in our show notes on YouTube and Podbean, so you can find those if you want to look more into those sources, right?
All right.
All right. Anyway, I'll try. So, in a complete curveball, I'm going to ask you to give me a down and dirty summary of the book. Will you earn the harps of glory or the trombone of failure?
I didn't see that coming. Okay. The story is told by an old sailor named Charles Marlowe, who tells of being hired by what we infer is a Belgian company to captain a steamer into the interior of Africa on what must be the Congo River, although Conrad never identifies the river or the country by name. His job is to transport ivory on a boat. He's heard all the platitudes about the Europeans' duty to bring civilization to the savages of Africa, but he's shocked by the condition of the indigenous people who have come under the influence of the civilizing European traders. This is kind of where you hear Branagh's comic tone. I mean, it's an extreme irony when Marlowe talks about the civilizing influence on these people, which basically is killing them.
Right.
The people are sick or they're worked nearly to death, or in the case of some who work for his company on the boat, they're detribalized natives who've been wrenched from their tribal culture and have found no code of ethics to replace it. They're what Marlowe calls, they have no restraint.
Well, they're nationless.
Yeah, well, they're cultureless.
Yeah, stateless and cultureless.
Marlowe finally focuses on finding the ivory procurement agent called Kurtz, who has a station far up the river and is reputed to be a rising star in the company, with high ideals concerning the whites' moral duty to colonize the Africans. But Kurtz is said to be ill, and Marlowe expects to find him and rescue him. What he finds, though, is something very different, and I'm going to leave it there so as not to include any spoilers.
Well, I mean, I should give you the trombone of failure because of the aside about Kenneth Branagh, which doesn't go into the down and dirty summary very well.
But it goes into what I was talking about earlier.
That's not, anyway, I'll give you the harps of glory because I'm in a generous mood.
I thank you.
Don't test me again, Ruud. All right, so this is really something I think of as a novella, right? It's not a long novel.
It's probably the shortest book on my list.
Yeah.
It's probably, depending on the edition you get and how small the print is,
right,
it's probably maybe 150 pages long.
Right, because that's why a lot of students read it.
Sure, that's why it's so popular, to be taught in introduction literature classes and things like that.
Because
it's not Bleak House.
Right, it's not Bleak House. You're not going to have only time to read a section of the novel, right, to discuss it. You can read the entire book.
Yeah.
And discuss its successes.
Yeah. And Conrad was one of the great modernists, and I've mentioned earlier.
But we're talking about why this book is lovable now, right?
What I want to talk about is why I picked it instead of some other books of Conrad's, because there are a lot of possibilities, because Conrad is one of the great modernists. And F.R. Leavis, who I mentioned in an earlier podcast, he had a 1948 critical work called The Great Tradition, in which basically he says the four great English novelists, these are only four, are Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James, and Joseph Conrad.
Wow, Dickens did not make that list.
Didn't make the list. I mean, he's respected by Leavis, but he doesn't make that list of the four. And your
favorite,
greatest.
Henry James, is there.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about Henry James another time.
All right.
And Conrad he's kind of a surprise being there in some ways. Well, he's a surprise being a great English novelist in any case, because his native language was Polish. He was born in what's now a part of Ukraine to Polish parents in what was then part of the Russian Empire.
And he wrote in English, though.
Right. But English was actually his third language, because after leaving his home country, he signed on with some French sailors and learned French. And then he learned English after he started sailing on English ships.
Sure. Okay. And we need some time context. So when was Heart of Darkness published?
It was serialized in 1899.
Oh, okay.
But it gets put on lists of the great 20th century novels because it was published in book form in 1902.
Yeah. Okay.
Earlier probably than some of Conrad's other great novels.
What, I'm embarrassed as a English major. What are some of his other novels?
He must have had some lousy instructors. But, okay, Lord Jim.
My Brit Lit 3 professor was absolute rubbish. Okay.
So Lord Jim is often on some of these great books lists. Nostromo, very often on great books lists. There's another book that he wrote late in his career that's a kind of an early spy novel called The Secret Agent. A lot of people like that book a lot. And Conrad's admired for his style, which is pretty amazing for somebody who's writing in their third language.
But sometimes that can be obviously that's part of why they write the way they do, is because they are a learner of the language. Dinesen wrote in English. She was Danish, living in, near English people in Africa, and wrote in English, and it just, nothing sounds like Dinesen because, she's writing in a language that she's learned later in life. So I don't think you could have the style without the fact that it's a second or third language.
Yeah. Well, Beckett, of course, Samuel Beckett, wrote everything in French first, and then translated it back into English, which was his native language. But he used French because it forced him to be more precise and thoughtful about each word, basically. Maybe that's part of what happens with Conrad. But he does create a kind of radiant, impressionistic prose. And he was admired by a lot of his contemporaries, including Henry James, also John Galsworthy, H.G. Wells, Stephen Crane, and Ford Madox Ford, who he actually wrote some novels with.
It's funny, I see them as so different, Conrad and James, as different eras. I guess it's just because the book I read by Conrad and the books I've read by James are so different from each other.
Yeah.
So, of course, they were contemporaries, but it's hard to see them that way.
Well, they're writing about whole different levels of society, and also, Conrad loves to write about the sea and foreign places, and James likes to write about what's happening in his head.
Class, I would say.
A lot of class, yeah.
All right, so what is lovable about the Heart of Darkness, a.k.a. Apocalypse Now?
Well, we'll talk about that at some point. It's probably the most vivid critique of European colonization
and imperialism
of any novel out there.
Of the time.
Well,
I think there's probably a lot. There are novels still being written about
there's still
the degradations of colonialism and imperialism. So,
but Conrad did it first,
right.
And really kind of bitterly. There's that strident, ironic tone to the way he describes these people and their hypocrisy.
The colonizers.
Yeah, the colonizers, the way they sugar over the truth of what they're actually doing with this hypocritical, we're going to bring the light of civilization to these savages.
When actually they are stripping away their civilizations and enslaving them.
Yeah, and basically their only real purpose is to make money.
Right. And
that becomes more and more clear to Marlowe as he goes on.
There is no moral center.
The colonizers are without restraint. restraint is this big word for Marlowe. It means...
Is that the narrator?
Marlowe is the narrator,
Okay.
yeah. It's what keeps you from being a savage. He does talk about the natives, particularly in the beginning, the way the other Europeans do. But
Because he has that view.
yeah, this is
Because it's a cultural viewpoint.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But being there makes him realize how ridiculous that idea is, because it's clear to him that there is restraint in the restraint comes from a moral center, which could come from any culture.
Right.
He's amazed at one point as he's going up the river, and chiefly he's going up the river to bring back a whole bunch of ivory. I mean, that's what they're there for. They're there for the ivory.
Right.
And it's like...
It's profit.
It's profit, and the ivory is what can get them the profit. But there are, on board the ship, some native Africans who are cannibals. Mm-hmm. And he comes to realize at one point that they haven't had anything to eat for days and days. And he realizes, if they really wanted to, they could just kill us and eat us. Mm-hmm. But they have this restraint.
Right. From their moral code.
They have a moral code.
Which they are actually living by.
Exactly.
Instead of just espousing and then doing something else.
Exactly.
Right.
There are other natives accompanying the Europeans on the boat that have become detribalized and have lost their moral center, and they haven't, completely assimilated into the European society, and they just do things without any clear purpose and that don't make much sense. Mm-hmm. And he says they have no restraint. And he ultimately comes to realize that Kurtz, who his quest is to go up the river and find Kurtz, who's sending back all this ivory, way more than anybody else. And when he meets him, he realizes why. That he's completely gone native, that he's completely ignored the moral restraint that he came there with, and has just turned into some sort of, well, I guess this is that spoiler that I was not going to talk about. But he has no restraint.
Right. I would just...
Because he's lost his moral center as well.
Yeah. I'm assuming you're being ironic when you say gone native, because if he had gone native, he would have a higher moral code than the people who sent him there, right?
Yeah.
Which is part of the irony of the Brana.
Irony. There's all kinds of irony.
The Brana reading. So book. Have you read, there's a nonfiction book, so no, you haven't read it, called King Leopold's Ghost. And it was... I
haven't read it. I remember you reading it, and I thought to myself, she'll want to talk about that book when we talk about Heart of Darkness.
Well, it's not ivory, it's rubber. And the King of the Belgians, Leopold, wanted his own colony because, dang it, all the other European royal families, royal houses had colonies, and he wanted a moneymaker, right?
Yeah.
So it sounds like this is based on that, because what they did to the people in Africa to get the rubber for the king, and for, the greatness of Belgium was, it was appalling.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it's the same situation. He just substitutes ivory.
Yeah.
It could be any kind of natural resource, right, that Europeans want for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And then instead of, entering into a trade deal, right, there's not as much profit. And it's the way that capitalism, unrestrained, allows no room for a moral code.
Yeah.
Because, I say this all the time, with capitalism, it's not more money, it's all the money.
Yeah.
So it's a zero sum, right? if we enter into a trade agreement with the people in Africa who live on these lands and can farm this rubber for us, we will make some money, but it won't be all the money. So instead, we will enslave the people and deny them their culture, take them away from their hierarchies and structures, denude them of their own moral codes, basically take away all power.
Yeah.
And because we do that, we will have all the money.
Yeah. It's not, there's no such thing as a win-win situation.
No.
It's a zero-sum game. I get everything, you get nothing.
But we know it's wrong.
Yes.
So we talk about what we're doing for them.
Yes. And you see that throughout The Heart of Darkness. Marlowe's been looking for, a job on a British ship, can't find it. He has an aunt living in Brussels, although, of course, he never names it. He never names it Belgium or
okay.
Brussels. He calls it the sepulchral city, like the whited sepulchres of the Gospels.
Wow.
And she, gets him this job because she has some connections with the company that is in Africa, stealing ivory, basically, because they need somebody who can pilot a boat up the river. And she's very proud of this because we're bringing Christianity to those people. It's all for their moral benefit. And Marlowe ventures to say that there might be a little bit of profit in there. And she says, well, the laborer is worthy of his hire.
Yeah.
Which is a
right.
biblical quotation that basically says that, if you work and earn something, you should get paid for it. But that's the hypocrisy.
Right.
But the people back there, the people back in Brussels, especially the women who are in favor of this whole situation, they're blind to what actually is happening.
Right.
There.
They're not going to be, that's not going to be splashed in the front of their newsletters and at their cocktail parties. And
no. It's how many Christian converts you got among those people hanging around the headquarters of the company, who he sees in the shade of the trees, just kind of lying there, essentially malnourished and dying.
Right.
Because they've been enslaved and been worked to death.
I saw an interview a while ago with Maya Angelou, and she talked about how, when she was confronted daily by racism in the United States and by, racist people, that part of the dynamic between her and them was the mutual knowledge that she was morally superior to them, because racism is not a high moral code, right? And that was part of the anger and the controlling, the urge to control by the person who was behaving in a racist way, was because they knew that she was their moral superior. And this discussion made me think of that.
Yeah.
Because I had never thought of that before, that when you confront that dehumanization and degradation, you're still on the higher moral ground.
Yeah. It's kind of the flip side of that is what you get in the character of Kurtz in Heart of Darkness. Kurtz is somebody who went to Africa with this very high ideal of what he was going to do there. And the realization of what he actually was doing there.
And was able to do.
It corrupted even this most moral of practitioners, I guess. Marlowe finds the journal that or I guess it's more of a pamphlet he's been working on.
Kurtz has been working
on. But when he gets to the place at the end of the river where Kurtz is. And it's got all these high ideals that he talks about, and then it just kind of stops, and he sees there's a comment scrawled on the last page that says, "Exterminate the brutes."
This isn't spoilers, is it?
I mean,
It is an old novel.
it's a novel, and I suspect that just about everybody listening to this will have read. But anyway,
But brutes is ambiguous.
yeah. But I think he's talking about the Africans who he went there to save. That now he's decided,
completely capitulated.
Yeah, now he's decided they're just these brutes. But Marlowe is loyal to Kurtz in the end because Kurtz at least had reasons for going there other than making a bunch of money. He says in the end, I had to be loyal to my own nightmare rather than the other one.
But it also, I mean, if this were a true story, you'd say, well, he's relating to the other white men.
Yeah, there's that.
Like, he's still not, he sees the horrors that are inflicted upon these people. Very, and yet he still relates to the inflictor.
Well, he relates to the suffering as well. But when I say he's loyal to Kurtz, he's loyal to him after he goes back and has to talk to people.
Oh, okay.
In fact, he has to talk to the intended, Kurtz's fiancée, who he's left in Brussels, who, like Marlowe's aunt, believes strongly in what they're doing.
Right.
Marlowe is a really interesting character because you see him change in his attitudes, and you see him hate the mendacity of the whole situation. He says very definitely at one point that the thing he hates the worst is a lie. He says, I hate, detest, and can't bear a lie. Not because I'm straighter than the rest of us, but simply because it appalls me. There's a taint of death, a flavor of mortality in lies, which is exactly what I hate and detest in the world and what I want to forget. When he goes to see the intended, she keeps talking to him about, oh, you've seen my Kurtz. You must have been so impressed by him and his ideals. And she goes on, and he keeps thinking, yeah, right. Yeah, sure. But he can't bear to pull the rug out from under her. He can't bear to destroy her illusions. And she says, you heard his last words. What were they? And as pretty much everybody knows, the last words of Kurtz were, the horror, horror. And he thinks about it first. He's kind of stunned, and he thinks, how far down this hole of darkness do I want to go? And he says, the last words he spoke were, your name.
Right.
And unless her name is the horror, he's lying.
Did you use that line when you taught the novel?
Oh, I did indeed.
Well, I mean, you say he's loyal to Kurtz, but he also is not going to shatter her, right?
Yeah.
Because when you lose somebody that you love, the worst thing to think is that they suffered.
Yeah.
So it also occurs to me, the poetry of the title, right? The Heart of Darkness, because it's about Africa. And so the tendency is to think that the darkness is the lack of civilization, in quotes, in Africa, right? This dark world. But the darkness is the colonialism that exists.
Yeah.
And the conflict between this capitalistic venture and like a moral society.
Yeah. And it's also the darkness at the heart of individuals.
Right.
Kurtz in the end has a heart of darkness.
Right. Right. He's not strengthening his moral muscle.
No, he's completely
giving over.
Given it up.
Yeah.
He's has no restraint in the end.
Well, it's interesting because I just listened to a podcast with Ezra Klein talking to Thomas Friedman. about China. And Thomas Friedman said several times, when I go to China and write about China, I'm really writing about the United States. And that's so fitting for this as well, because Conrad isn't writing about Africa. He's writing about
Europeans.
European and colonial
Belgian
societies,
colonialism.
right? The action takes place in Africa,
Yeah.
but he's writing about Europe.
Yeah, the darkness is not
Right.
in Africa.
Right.
The darkness is inside you.
That's interesting.
Now, and people have interpreted the book in different ways, and one of the most famous interpretations comes from Chinua Achebe, who actually thought it was a justification for colonialism. That was Conrad's attitude.
Did he write Things Fall Apart?
Yes.
Okay.
Achebe called the novel an offensive and deplorable book that dehumanized and depersonalized African people, and called Conrad a racist and a xenophobe. You can read it that way, I think, but if you're tempted to read it that way, I think you should listen to Kenneth Branagh's.
Yeah, but here, you have to say, Kenneth Branagh also white European.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you can only approach it from your own perspective.
Yeah.
And his perspective is going to be vastly different, right? Especially, I mean, I can't remember, are there any people who are indigenous who are major characters in the book?
No.
Well, I mean, that's
not,
dehumanizing,
they're not
right?
major characters.
Right.
I mean, there are characters, but he's focusing on the colonizers.
I understand.
But,
and he's writing about Europe
yeah.
in Africa. But I can see why you would have that point of view.
I think you could make that point, but I think that if you confuse Marlowe with Conrad, Marlowe's attitudes in the beginning of the book reflect what Achebe is saying, but Marlowe's attitudes change as the more he sees.
Right. And also, you're right that there is a speaker in the book. The speaker may not be the author.
Yeah. So I mean, Achebe may be reacting more to the situation than he is to the author. But it is a way of reading it. However, on the other hand, E.D. Morrell, who was the British journalist who led the successful campaign against slavery and other abuses in King Leopold's Congo Free State, called The Heart of Darkness the most powerful thing written on the subject.
Well, he introduces the reality to the propagandistic fantasy.
Yeah.
No, it's not a propagandistic fantasy. It is an emotional motivator to overlay the real motivation, which is profit.
Yeah. There's there are
reasons not to love the book.
Africans particularly who don't see it that way.
Well, sure. And I think that I can see why.
Yeah.
I think it would struggle, when you know better, you do better, quoting Maya Angelou again. And I think it would be difficult to teach the novel because it's like layers all the way down. Right?
Yeah.
If you're going to do just a surface run of it, which would be difficult, any literary work is hard to teach as a surface, right? This and this and this. But would you even have time enough to keep going to the next layer and the next layer? And then looking at it now with these other voices who say, no, right? Like, yeah, this is a classic novel of white European literature. However, these are ways to see this novel that are, it's not positive. Times change and we learn more, but I think one of the reasons you love it, obviously, is also the style of the writing.
Yeah, that's true.
So these things are hard.
Yeah, whether you agree with Achebe or not, I think it's probably important to note that Conrad is not Kipling.
Yeah.
That there's nothing in here about.
Yeah.
Well, there actually is something in here that relates to the white man's burden idea, but it's precisely what Conrad is criticizing. So
Yeah.
it's not that.
Right. Well, that's interesting. What are other reasons people might not love the book?
No, I think that's the
big
main
one.
reason, yeah. Well, here's something about Conrad that is probably true of all of his books. In Lord Jim, for instance, you're never quite sure exactly what happened when he jumped ship. In Nostromo.
Are you spoiling all of these books for us with these?
No, I'm just saying.
Okay,
you're not
I haven't
sure,
read them, so I don't
You're
know.
not absolutely certain what happens in Nostromo.
Oh, okay.
At the climactic point. And you're not absolutely certain what happens in Heart of Darkness at the climactic point. You don't know exactly what Kurtz was doing.
So there's strategic ambiguity.
Yeah.
And maybe you don't like that as a reader.
You might not.
Right. Interesting. Okay. Did Conrad, did he go to Africa during this time?
Yes.
So
this is
his novel is informed by things he may have witnessed personally.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
This is taken from personal experience.
Right. So he saw for himself that the emotional overlay was not the actual motivation.
Yeah. And he saw for himself what was happening to the native population because of this greed.
Right. Interesting. So before we go on to the ranking, you mentioned before we were going to talk about Apocalypse Now.
But I thought we'd at least talk about some of the adaptations that have been made.
There's been a lot of them.
There have been. Orson Welles created a radio play that aired in 1938, and he planned a film version that never got made, where he was going to make Kurtz a fascist dictator. But probably the most famous adaptation of the book was Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, in which he makes the story a parable of America's descent into madness in the Vietnam War, which, there's a lot of similarity because, we go into the Vietnam War with this.
We're going to save them from communism.
Exactly.
We don't know anything about them or how they live.
And we don't really know anything about communism.
Nor do we care.
In Southeast Asia. We just know that if Vietnam falls, then so will Laos and Cambodia and Thailand and Indonesia and Australia is all going to fall like dominoes. There's this, we're going to save you from yourselves attitude, which
somebody needs to save us.
It'd be nice. But some other things have happened. There's been an opera of Heart of Darkness that premiered in London Royal Opera House in 2011.
Yeah, it'd be a great opera.
The acclaimed
you can imagine the final aria.
He said your name. Anne Pratchett, the acclaimed author, wrote a novel in 2011 called State of Wonder, which takes place among female scientists in Brazil. And the sci-fi film Ad Astra.
Yeah.
The Kurtz character is a scientist who's sort of gone rogue on the edge of the solar system. There's all kinds of ways that the story has been adapted to more contemporary things. Yeah,
I guess it is kind of archetypal that the psyche breaks apart when its beliefs are confronted with an uncooperative reality.
That is...
That's your down and dirty summary.
Okay. That is a thematic statement.
It's a
more
long
than
line.
a summary of the plot.
Yeah. I mean, that happens. That can happen anytime, right? That you think something, you believe it so much to be true, and then you find out so painfully that it is the opposite of true.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It is an archetypal kind of a story.
Right. It was a journey, a quest.
It's a journey. It's a quest. Northrop Frye, nobody reads him anymore, but in 1957 he published what was at the time a very influential analysis called Anatomy of Criticism, where he identified 4 archetypal types of literature and suggested that in some ways, every story fits into one of these archetypes. Right. And there's comedy and tragedy, which are the archetypes related to fall and spring.
Right.
And then there's romance, which is the archetypal story that's related to summer, because everything that happens in this isn't romance like Love and Kisses. This is romance like the medieval quest. That's the archetype of summer. This archetype of winter he calls irony, which doesn't mean what we think of irony meaning today. It really means anti-romance. It basically takes the form of romance, but instead of having everything come out rosy, it shows that everything sucks.
Okay, so
this is an anti-romance. It's a quest that whose end is not successful. In fact, it's destructive.
Well, and also winter is barren, right?
Yeah.
It's a wasteland. Exactly. It's not fecund. It's not harvest. It's not new life.
Yeah.
It's the death.
Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, well, that's cool. All right. Well, now we have to have the ranking. So, where are you going to put this uplifting novella?
I'm going to put this lovable novella.
Why do you love it?
I mean,
we've talked about it's so depressing.
It's depressing, but it's depressing in a way that makes you feel like you've read something that's really meaningful. Mm-hmm.
So it blows up your mind a little bit, or it lights up your mind even while it's pulling you down a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I think I'm going to put it at number 19.
Ooh. What's at 18 now then?
Well, it would be between Watership Down and just ahead of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
So then if you're reading through the list, you'll read The Heart of Darkness, and then now for something completely different.
Here's The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Here's The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Although they're both questy.
Well, and Watership Down, of course, is a more
classic
traditional quest. It's more of a romance.
All right. Well, very interesting. That was a fascinating revisit of that classic.
And now I think it must be time for Chaos Reader.
Well, I'm doing a little better. I haven't finished a book, but I have been reading a little more. But I did want to talk about I have started several books of complete poems, and those aren't things, you read through, right? Like I sometimes will read.
Especially if it's as thick as that one.
Yeah, this is Anne Sexton, the complete poems of Anne Sexton. And my students respond quite a bit to her The Fury of Overshoes, which is, I think, in the Norton Anthology that we read in Introduction to Poetry. And I really like her. There's a lot of verve and life in her poetry, and she's iconoclastic. She'll face off things that people weren't, polite society didn't necessarily talk about. So I thought I'd get this book out and just revisit it. It has a foreword by Maxine Kumin. So
who was her best friend, I think.
In fact, they had lunch.
She was the last person to see her
shortly before she died by suicide.
Yeah.
So
another uplifting book.
Yeah. Well, the poems are, though. I mean, and that's, that is something I talk about with students. Right. But just like Heart of Darkness, poems that shed light on dark aspects of our lives can be very valuable and life-changing, just ask Sharon Holtz. But I think it's important. I think this happens a lot with Plath, maybe more so, just she's maybe a little bit better known than Sexton. It's very important not to allow the way that they died to overshadow their ability as poets. I mean, they're famous poets. They aren't famous poets because they died by suicide, right? They're famous poets because they are brilliant poets, and their poetry opens up your mind and lights up your mind and gives you ideas you didn't have before you read their poems, right? Yeah. So, we do know these things about her, and she is a confessional poet and did die in this tragic way. And, she was not an easy person to know. That's, I think, maybe a offensively euphemistic way of talking about some of the issues in her personal life. But her poems are very good, and they're very emblematic of a changing society and the ways that women found themselves still really held down by conventional femininity, and yet have had their minds opened because of their new access to education, right? So anyway, Complete Poems of Anne Sexton.
Awesome.
Chaos Reader Book of the Week.
Woohoo. Well, on that note,
we'd like to thank our producing sensei, Jerry Bruno, for continuing to help us.
And I'd like to thank our listener.
We have listeners. We have listeners from all over the world.
That's true. We've had them from Nigeria,
Poland,
yeah,
Brazil. They're all over. So thank you for listening. Please share our podcast with your friends and fellow book lovers, and we'll see you next week. Between the covers.